Chag Sameach, happy holiday. We're approaching the closing days of Passover. The very last day of Passover includes a very special prayer called Yizkor, may God remember. It's a prayer devoted to remembering the deceased who continue, in a certain sense, to walk in our hearts. I'm going to tell you now about the evolution of the most common prayer that we say in memory of the deceased, the Kaddish prayer. I'm going to begin in a strange place. I'm going to tell you a Jewish legend. It's actually a kind of a ghost story, and in some ways it's a little bit ghoulish, but it has a happy ending. It comes from the Talmud. The story is told about a famous rabbi who was walking on the way when he saw a horrifying sight, a person being savagely beaten. He ran up to investigate and to try to help, and he realized that he was not looking at just a regular person, he was looking at a shade, someone who had died. And the agents who were beating him were ministering angels. And the shade said to him, "Rabbi, I deserve what's coming to me. I'm a flagrant sinner. And worst of all, I fathered an illegitimate child." The rabbi went to investigate. He found the child, he adopted the child, took him into his home, taught him to pray. On the day, sometime later, when that child was able to lead the congregation in prayer, that night, the shade appeared in the rabbi's dream and said, "Bless you, Rabbi. As you have finally given me respite from my torments, so may you be given blessing forever." That story might well have been forgotten or consulted only by specialists in Jewish folklore, had it not been for its use as a citation in the 1200s by a rabbi who wanted to justify what was then a new practice. The rabbi's name was Isaac of Vienna. The new practice, as he described it, was to have a child, a boy, who was an orphan, and not just anyone else, have that child in particular lead the congregation at the end of the Saturday morning Shabbat prayers, after the Ein Kelohenu prayer, which is just 2 or 3 prayers before the end. That child would lead the congregation in the recitation of the Kaddish. The rabbi from Vienna, Rabbi Isaac, said, this story is warrant for an orphan, not someone else, leading the prayer, because the story shows that a son can transfer spiritual merit to the soul of his deceased father in such a way as will help him in his posthumous journey. That's quite a remarkable citation. It's not the only way one might read that story. Interestingly enough, at about the same time, another rabbi, Rabbi Simcha of Vitry, a rabbi in France, a few years before this Rabbi Isaac, said the same story proves something else. The same story proves that on Saturday night, when the Shabbat is over, and we look for someone to lead the weeknight prayer of Saturday night, we should find an orphan. Not someone else, but an orphan, a man, not a boy, but someone who's been bereaved, and that person will lead the service. And the same notion was going on. Rabbi Simcha said, we well know, and this too is a bit of Jewish folklore, of course, that the fires of hell are only burning 6 days a week. They're stopped on the Shabbat. So Saturday night, before the fires are lit up again, that's the right time to have an orphaned son, a bereaved man, lead the prayers. Perhaps the divine parole board will decide to let the father into heaven once and for all. With this story and its 2 different interpretations, we catch a custom at the beginning. The custom was to do something special so that we, the living, might make connection in a certain spiritual way with the deceased ancestors for whose welfare we pray. This all rests upon a rather sober vision of what happens after you die. It's a vision that was popular in the Middle Ages, perhaps less so today. And that vision was that most Jewish people, because after all, no one is a perfectly righteous person, most people have to go to Gehinnom for some period of time, somewhat less than 12 months, which would be the maximum sentence for reprobate sinners. Now, this is not the Talmud. In the Talmud, this view was the dour Shammai's view, whereas the more cheerful Hillel said, well, as for the run-of-the-mill person, God's mercy helps get that person into heaven right away. In other words, the Talmud had the notion that after you die, your soul faces a judgment. But not until the Middle Ages did the consensus of Jewish opinion become so gloomy that most people were in Gehinnom and in fact needed such help as could perhaps be given from this world to the world beyond. But that was the Middle Ages. It was a hard time. People had gloomy outlooks in general. This was true of Christians as well as the Jews who lived amongst them. How about modern times? If we don't have the same belief about what happens after you die, do we have the same understanding of why you say the Kaddish for a deceased relative? Now here we're going to find a fascinating example of old wine being poured into new bottles. The notion of people going to hell after they die has almost disappeared from Jewish thought, except in certain very traditional circles. So what happens to the reason for saying the Kaddish if the original reason has evaporated? If the dead literally do not need our help, and if that was the rationale for saying the Kaddish, why do we say it today? Because the truth is, people are very committed to saying the Kaddish. It's a prayer that resonates at the level of people's souls. But if you ask them, what are you doing when you say the mourner's prayer? They'll give an answer which is naturalistic, not supernaturalistic in orientation. They'll say something like, I'm declaring my faith even at a time of grief, because grief promotes doubt, and faith is how I confront my doubt. Or they'll say, I'm standing with my people. We do the recitation of the Kaddish only when there's a proper prayer quorum, when we're surrounded by the other adult Jewish members of our community, and they respond to us. So the healing takes place in the bosom of our community. I'm reinforcing that at a time of great emotional challenge. Or they'll say something like this: the ones I miss are still present in their values. They're still walking in my heart. And so by proclaiming the value of holiness, which is the basic meaning of Kaddish, I'm proclaiming that God is holy, that the human is in the image of God, the human is holy, and holiness cannot die. So I'm saying a prayer that allows me to confront death with an assertion of life. All of these statements are beautiful statements. None of these statements are the original statement, but all of them are valid. The truth is, we're not confined to the original understanding of any particular practice in our religion. Customs, laws, practices, they grow along with the people who practice them. This year, in many ways, is a different year than all preceding years of Passover for our people. Why is this Passover different from all other Passovers? We all know the answer. So if we've experienced a growth, a different rationale for doing the same old beloved customs, so be it. That's the way it needs to be. Wishing you all a wonderful and happy and fulfilling close of Passover. Shalom.